Copperfields Books was founded in 1981 in Northern California, and at first, it seemed to be doing everything right. Copperfields was doing what an independent bookstore ought to be doing: popular, profitable, and growing. It enjoyed 13 straight years of growth, in fact. There seemed to be no reason to change the winning formula. From the perspective of the internal workings of Copperfield, everything functioned smoothly and well. But in the outside environment, consisting of competitors and customers and market forces, the world was changing rapidly and radically. In 1995, stagnation set in, and Copperfield Books saw its profits begin to decline. It was forced to close stores. It still offered the same product in the same superb venues, but apparently something had changed. It was the outside world that had changed. It is this changing environment and how we respond to it that we focus on in this lecture. The business world is always changing, evolving in unexpected ways. I like to view the business world as a great wheel that turns slowly. This great wheel of business constantly turns, and it brings change, slow change, sudden change, many changes. Now, we can't ignore this great wheel of business. We can't pretend that it doesn't affect us. It falls to us to determine what changes are important to us and to our business. It falls to us to figure out how best to cope with those changes. And we began with the tale of Copperfield's Books, emblematic of the independent bookstore in modern America. But this bastion of Americana was about to face its greatest challenge in the mid-1990s, as the book retailing industry was to undergo tremendous upheaval. Such upheaval that Hollywood even made a feature film about the book business. The changing character of the book business in the 1980s and 90s was told in cinema in the film You've Got Mail that featured Tom Hanks and Meg Ryan. This 1998 film tells the story of a small bookstore being forced out of business by a big box bookstore similar to Borders or to Barnes & Noble. The film depicts the great wheel of business as it turns and forces people and companies to adapt to the external world. One new feature of this changing competitive environment was the arrival and continuing expansion of Borders, which itself began as a used bookstore in Ann Arbor, Michigan in 1971. Borders reached its peak in 2003 with 1,200 stores, each filled with thousands of new titles. Borders was a heavyweight of the book-selling industry, rivaled only by Barnes & Noble. Copperfield Books, on the other hand, was one of many small and medium-sized independent bookstores. Now, these stores faced dramatic changes in the competitive environment that threatened their very existence. Suddenly, people had alternatives to buying books at Copperfield's. They could go to the newly arrived mega bookstore chains offered by Borders and Barnes & Noble. People could buy books on the internet with a new online firm called Amazon.com. Books could be delivered to their doorstep more cheaply and from a much wider selection. If this wasn't enough, suddenly something appeared on the horizon called the e-reader. This meant that the actual physical product that Copperfield sold might begin to disappear. To survive these powerful new external forces, Copperfield's would have to change the way it did business, the product mix it offered, and the selling experience itself. It would need to look beyond whatever strategic planning it might have done previously and engage instead in a strategic analysis into how to survive and prosper under new conditions. Strategic thinking means setting aside our impressionistic view of the world and thinking rationally about causes and effects, actions and reactions, and then making our way successfully to our goals, while others drift and bob on a sea of chaos. This means imposing order on what we see. It means filtering out static and letting in information we can use in an orderly, logical fashion. Let's start thinking about the world around us and how we can best assess and marshal our capabilities to take advantage of the opportunities that present themselves. The business world has developed numerous tools of analysis that aid business people in making sense of what they do, how they do it, when they do it. We can use those tools for ourselves in our personal lives and in achieving our professional goals. Today, we learn about 4 tools of strategic analysis, what they do, how to use them, and how they benefit us in crafting prudent strategy. The tools are pest analysis, 5 forces analysis, value chain analysis, and finally, looking at all our strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats taken together, an analysis known in business schools as the SWOT. First, a scan of our external environment, known as PEST. Well, PEST, P-E-S-T, is an acronym, and it stands for political, economic, social, and technical. Attention to all 4 ensures the most comprehensive evaluation of the factors that may impinge on us, the pursuit of our goals. Through PEST, we discover if factors in these 4 realms help us or hinder us. We discover opportunities that we can seize. We learn of threats we must deflect, threats and opportunities we would otherwise have missed. One caveat: we cannot do a meaningful pest analysis without our mission and objectives in mind. We must anchor our analysis in what it is we are and what we want to achieve. Only with this analytical anchor will the analysis take on meaning. For instance, take our book-selling example. The book-selling industry faces a variety of economic and technical pressures that differ dramatically from the types of political pressures faced by, say, the automobile industry or the pharmaceutical industry. Consequently, a pest analysis for Copperfield's books would be focused accordingly. Now, our political environment affects all of us in ways we may not even suspect. In a large macro sense, that environment, our nations, our states, or our local government's leadership and bureaucracy. In a personal sense, it describes the web of power relationships we deal with in our lives at work and at play. With our mission and our objective in mind, we explore the power relationships that impinge on us. We ask the question, what power relationships hinder me? Which ones can assist me? What are the legal regulations that affect me? Everything from business zoning in local neighborhoods to tax laws to protection of intellectual property. For example, physical bookstores may face different tax policies than online booksellers. And later, a common policy may be imposed that treats both the same. The political climate is like a powerful tide that shifts first one way and then the other. For example, new medical instruments for surgery may be regulated as stringently as pharmaceuticals and subject to a very long waiting period for government approval. Or they may be less regulated. It makes good sense for us to ascertain which way that tide is shifting and when. And it makes sense for us to craft ways to swim with the tide instead of against it. Now, we conduct our business within an economic environment, and this supports what we want to do or not. If we want to start our own consulting business, we should ask basic questions such as, are there enough customers out there willing to pay my fee? Questions like these may give us pause and clarify our thinking with a dose of hard-nosed reality. How much capital do we need to achieve our needed capability? Does the economic environment favor me over my competitors, or the converse? Now, what trends and fads are in play in the social and cultural environment? What substantial and rooted long-term cultural factors must I consider? Can I identify tomorrow's trend based on today's indicators? Am I looking over the horizon at tomorrow's implications over what is happening today? The technological environment. Does the tech environment support what I want to do? Or are there threats I have to consider? Now, in Copperfield's case, longer-term threats that might have given pause were the increasing popularity of online bookselling and, taking a longer perspective, the advent of the e-reader. Now, let's move to a tool of analysis that focuses on our own industry. One of Michael Porter's most famous contributions is his technique for analyzing the forces that impact competition within an industry. This technique is called the 5 forces model. We can use this model with minor tweaking to evaluate the impinging forces of virtually any competitive situation, from the computer industry to our personal occupation, even to personal romantic relationships. The 5 forces of competition are buyer power, supplier power, the intensity of rivalry, the threat of substitutes, and the threat of new entrants. These forces compel us to answer a series of questions about our industry and our place in that industry. How much power do our customers have over us? How much power do our suppliers have over us? How intense is the rivalry we have with others in our industry, in our field? Are we forced into constant battles with them that affect our profit margins? How easily can our buyers switch to substitute products, for, say, orange juice instead of apple juice, the electronic books and other electronic media instead of physical books? What is the danger of new entrants into our industry? Copperfield Books was faced with the challenge of powerful new forces in the competitive environment. These forces threatened the position of not only Copperfield, but of other brick and mortar booksellers as well, even the big ones. So, how did Copperfields and Borders contend with the 5 forces of competition? Let's take a look. First, the power of buyers, the bookstore customers. Customers had tremendous power at the time. They could purchase identical books from a wide variety of retailers. Price was a major consideration, and there was not much loyalty to stores offering similar products in a similar format. Next, the power of suppliers to bookstores, the major publishers. Both Copperfields and Borders obtained books from publishers, but the big change could order in massive volume and receive big discounts that were unavailable to independents. The power of publishers exerted a disproportionately negative impact on independent bookstores, such as Copperfield's. Next, the intensity of rivalry among the players in the retail book industry. This is a hotly contested market. There was lots of rivalry. There was a surge of megastores and consolidation, but it is basically a mature industry with very low growth rates. What about the threat of substitutes? People can get their books in many places, in libraries, online from libraries, and in many stores that don't specialize in books. And books face increased competition from other forms of entertainment, television, radio, internet, computer games, movies, and such like. If books get too expensive, people switch. Finally, the threat of new entrants. There is little or no room for new players in this market. It requires much capital. And to be frank, it is an unattractive industry with low profit margins and low growth rates. This analysis of the industry would have told Copperfields that it was time to consider a change of business model to cope with these exogenous variables that seemed trending in a negative direction. The correlation of forces was moving against the undifferentiated little bookshop around the corner that offers a limited selection of high-priced books and nothing else. The 5 forces analysis tells us clearly that we must change something in the way we do business, or we won't be in business much longer. Value chain analysis is a tool that can tell us a great deal about our own internal strengths and weaknesses. Now, the value chain is a method of analysis that takes apart the firm, divides the firm into its value-producing activities, and the point is to evaluate what makes our firm strong and what makes it weak. As it, say, manufactures a product. We call this a chain of activities because it's a series of processes, all of which add value to a product. We can apply this type of analysis to most any fairly complex series of activities. We can, say, disassemble a football team, an automobile company, an army platoon, or our own series of activities. And we can evaluate how each part contributes to the whole. Let's take as an example a football team. The overall performance of a football team is captured in its won-loss record and in the final scores of games that it plays. If other teams score 7 to 8 touchdowns per game against us, and we score 7 to 8 touchdowns as well, we can observe that our defense is terrible and our offense is great. But this does not tell us anything specific. In fact, scores of games and overall record can hide the contribution of the components that actually provide team strength or team weakness. If we analyze the separate activities of the offense and defense, we begin to get a clearer picture of the team's strengths player by player. Many fans already do this type of value chain analysis with their favorite sports teams. Sophisticated fans don't stop with the win-loss record or the scores of games. These fans delve deep into the issue to discover the impact of other factors. Without even knowing it, these fans are conducting a type of value chain analysis. They disassemble the team and the staff, and they look at their contributions, the contributions of the players, whether tight ends, wide receivers, running backs, the backfield defense, the generalship and strategy and tactics of the coaches and quarterback, the personnel decisions, the scouting reports for the games. They search for the root causes of dysfunction in their favorite team. Could it be the offensive line, the defensive line? What about the head coach, the general manager, or the owner? And what about the fans? Each of these factors we evaluate according to our own internal calculation. When it's done formally, we can call it value chain analysis. We assess the contribution of the processes that make up the whole, and we do it with the mission and objectives in mind. We want to win the championship. We want to score points to prevent the other team from scoring. Now, another example of a value chain is your personal value chain, the things that you do to accomplish your self-defined mission. What are these functions and how well do you do them? Now, we're fortunate in an advanced economy that most of us specialize in pursuing our goals while living fairly comfortable lives. Contrast this with the value chain of a U.S. pioneer in, say, the early to mid-19th century. Such pioneer men and women living on the frontier survived in a much different and a simpler economy than we enjoy today. Rather than enjoying the wide variety of goods we take for granted, a primitive and much less communal lifestyle meant that, well, mere survival occupied the value chain functions: building shelter, making clothing, obtaining food, providing security, and all of this absorbed time. It also led to a lower standard of living in that people simply do not possess top-notch skills in all the value-producing functions that yield the necessities of life, things like clothing, shelter, food, security. And just as we cannot do everything well, neither can business firms. Both firms and people outsource the functions that they cannot do well and retain the functions that constitute core strengths. For instance, Borders Bookstore had added some cafes inside its bookstores, but later decided to approach Starbucks about operating those cafes instead. Now, we as individuals outsource functions such as clothing manufacture and the farming of vegetables so that we can concentrate on our strengths. Now, so we can see how value chain analysis can be quite revelatory, zeroing in on what we must change and what we should continue. Now, here is where we match our internal analysis with our external analysis. The value chain assesses our strengths and weaknesses. The 5 forces in our industry and a scan of the broader pest environment show us our external threats and the opportunities. We can now list these strengths and our weaknesses and match them against the external opportunities and threats. Do our strengths match the opportunities available? Do our weaknesses make us vulnerable to the most salient threats? The tool for bringing these together is called the SWOT, which stands for Strengths, Weaknesses, Opportunities, and Threats. Think of the SWOT with respect to our original example, Copperfield's books. The changing external environment meant that an old strength of the brick-and-mortar bookstore had been transformed into a weakness, a relative lack of choice. In the retail book industry, the external threats loomed large and attacked Copperfield's weaknesses. The opportunities all seemed to be in favor of the big box bookstore and the almost simultaneous rise of online bookselling, which together spelled the end of the independent bookstore as we knew it in the late 1980s. The changing external environment ensured that Copperfield's books would ultimately fail if it did not alter its business model. This clear example shows us what happens if we focus only on what we do to the exclusion of what others do and to the exclusion of macro factors that change the very assumptions that support our strategy. And so Borders, Barnes & Noble, and Amazon.com seem to win as hundreds of small bookstores close their doors for the last time. The great wheel of business turns, and it does not care if we cope with the changes. It turns inexorably, and it is up to us to figure out what changes are afoot and how to best cope with those changes and chart a new strategic direction. The obvious move for Copperfields was to offer book buyers something attractive in the store that they could receive no other place. And so Copperfields nimbly crafted a persona that was uniquely local in flavor and that offered local book buying and socializing experience to its clientele, experiences that were unavailable either online or in the mega bookstores. Copperfields survived. Meanwhile, the great wheel of business continued to turn, and the same factors that assaulted the independents, like Copperfield's books, soon began to undermine the powerful Borders chain. Borders had been the apparent victor in the 1990s and was seemingly unstoppable. But Borders did not respond to further changes in the external environment. Borders committed serious strategic errors that its fraternal big box competitor Barnes & Noble largely avoided. Let's see what happened to Borders. First, Borders failed to recognize its vulnerability to the internet. Borders refused to embrace the new technology. Instead of recognizing the potential and adapting to the new wired and connected world, Borders outsourced the sale of many of its books online from 2001 to 2008 to Amazon. By contrast, Barnes & Noble had experience with mail-order sales dating back to the 19th century. They recognized an opportunity to transition from mail-order catalogs to online selling. Borders also missed the growing importance of the e-reader. While Amazon introduced the Kindle in 2007 and a second generation in 2009, Barnes & Noble introduced the Nook in 2009, and Apple entered the same market space with its iPad in April of 2010. Borders ignored the threat until, well, too late, it partnered in 2010 with Kobo, a bargain e-reader whose majority owner at the time was the Canadian big box retailer Indigo Books and Music. It was a Me Too effort, almost an afterthought. So first, we saw how the big box retailer displaced the little independent bookstore. And in the same dynamic, the online booksellers later began to displace the big boxes with the largest selection of books at lower prices. Perhaps Borders was still consolidating its position and looking to shorter-term goals like growth and excellence. Borders neglected the one advantage it still carried as a brick-and-mortar bookseller, a place for people to gather. Big Box was a place where you could go, where you could sit, where you could sip great coffee and meet others of like mind. Borders did not recognize this aspect of the brick-and-mortar bookstore as a crucial life-and-death source of advantage, as it turned out. Now, this lack of perspicacity was evidenced when it lost a Starbucks contract to Barnes & Noble. Instead of signing Starbucks, Borders ended up with Seattle's Best, which is the wholly owned subsidiary of Starbucks that focuses on coffee without the full coffee house experience. Anne Lowry is a business writer for the New York Times, and she captured the essence of the issue and how Barnes & Noble's response differed from Borders. It's very, very hard to compete unless you're offering a very boutique experience. Barnes & Noble at least has built a business that recognizes the trends in bookselling toward the internet, toward e-readers, toward a more boutique retail experience, and away from big box stores. Borders had locked itself into a big box. Borders had opened too many stores. It had signed too many long-term leases, and this meant that underperforming stores could not be closed. Borders was trapped in an unprofitable and ultimately a self-damning situation. And Borders says that a host of factors led to its demise, including the turbulent economy, the move away from brick-and-mortar stores to online retailers, and the rise of e-readers like Amazon's Kindle, Apple's iPad, and the Nook of rival Barnes & Noble. But every bookstore faced competitive pressures, the same competitive pressures. It's the response to those pressures that means success or failure. Now, the changes in the industry in the mid-1980s into the 21st century have challenged booksellers of every type. New technologies and new ways of doing business meant that bookstores would have to evaluate how they did business. No, it did not automatically mean that the traditional bookstore would go out of business. But it did mean that the traditional bookstore would have to reinvent itself as something special. To survive, it would have to find a new business model to sustain itself on into the 21st century. It would have to recognize that the brick and mortar model of bookselling would have to offer something more than books. It would have to offer unique products and a unique customer experience. As for the independent bookstores that were supposedly doomed back in the 1990s, a substantial number of them are still doing quite well, but only because they adapted. Many have diversified into selling things like coffee and alcohol and rare books, as well as offering regular talks, book groups, and classes, all to provide tailored services to a distinct clientele. They have differentiated themselves in ways to provide a distinctive service. Now, in the end, this is what Copperfields did and what Borders did not do. Another turn of the business wheel has left Borders in memory, and a case study for thousands of MBA students to learn how not to craft and implement strategy. The mega bookseller that threatened Copperfields could not survive in a world with new and multiple channels for book delivery. Borders went bankrupt in 2011. And Copperfields? Ironically, it survived Borders, and it has grown to 7 stores in Northern California. Copperfields Books remade itself into a unique place that transcends the bookstore as simply a location to purchase undifferentiated stock off the shelf. It offers rare and antiquarian books. It offers author events, writing workshops, the purchasing of used books from customers, and online access to book buying. Late, but not too late, Copperfields adapted its internal processes to accommodate the changing external environment. We've seen how the tools of strategic analysis can give us the crucial intelligence we need to evaluate our strategic direction and to change that direction if need be. This willingness to adapt to external realities as revealed to us by our analysis, now this is the key to business success, and in some cases, to very survival.